It was a few months ago when I was reading a book that has possibly become one of the most familiar books to me, the book of Ezekiel, that I began to think of this theme, and then later on felt it might be a good theme for me to reassert here, although over the years this book has spoken to me through the writing of that prophet under the inspiration of God. Because there are some incredible things that transpire in this particular book, written shortly before the fall of the city of Jerusalem. And it fell upon the shoulders of a young man about 30 years old in exile to tell the people some of the most difficult things he had to tell them as God had revealed that truth to him. One of the truths that God had revealed was that the glory of God was going to depart from his people. God was going to bid farewell to them. Nearly 1,000 years had gone by since the Exodus, and this is now going to be the darkest moment in Israel's history. If you have never read the book of Ezekiel in one setting, I urge you to do it. It is an incredibly powerful, powerful book. In fact, if I'm to be honest with you, some of those concepts that he portrays of what God was going to do in the midst of the people in the form of judgment are so graphic, so pungent, you'd almost have to think twice before reading them in public. But here it is. Ezekiel had to tell them all the entailments of a departed glory. And what I'd like to do is answer the question, what happened to this nation that squandered its history? What happened to a people so uniquely privileged, once upon a time dwelling with that marvelous glory so accessible to them? And now in an incredible scene, there is a movement of this radiance and this presence, and there is a hesitance as that glory leaves the inner sanctuary, taken by these messengers that are known as the cherubim, move to the door and pause for a moment, hesitantly, almost like a reluctant departure. And finally, that glory is going to move away from that people until the latter part of the book when we are told how that glory is going to return. I would like to begin by illustrating for you from the lives of two men. One whose name you have heard, even if you have not particularly studied his philosophy, but another whose name is probably not familiar to you, but the impact of whose life all of us are familiar with. There's possibly not a nation in the world that has not recognized the impact of this other individual whose name they do not know. I'm referring to Jean-Henri Dunant, a Swiss-born individual. Many of us might find the name quite foreign to us. But Dunant was a young man growing up in a deep sense of commitment to Jesus Christ. And as he became a young man, his mind began to wander into all kinds of business enterprises. He was determined he was going to build an empire. And as he was setting this infrastructure, nothing was going to stop him. He began to wander away from some of the truths that he treasured and held dear to his heart. When he was only 17 years old, he was leading Bible studies. But now in his 20s, his sights were set on other glories and other goals and moved him away from these treasured truths. In fact, so determined was he to try to establish this business that he even walked through a field strewn with carcasses during the war between France and Austria. And as he was going through this battlefield where thousands lay dying, he began to see these battered bodies. But his mind was set on meeting Napoleon III in order that he could get a permit to build these buildings for his business. And as he walked past these dead and battered bodies, he began to wonder if his priorities were really right. But he got to Napoleon III, and the story goes on in many, many dramatic and melodramatic ways. But as he walked away from the Battle of Solferino, in which he was a non-participant, God used that incident to bore into his conscience so that he would wrestle with these issues in his mind, and was going to give this world one of the greatest gifts that we have today, because Dunant founded the Red Cross. But if you were to read his biography, this is what he will tell you. When he was an old man with a long flowing white beard, about to receive the Nobel Prize, he sat alone in his room and got right with God, repented of all the years he had squandered, and will tell you that the greatest treasure in his heart, as wonderful as the Red Cross Society was given to the world and all the accolades that were given to him, the treasure that he clung to with his dying day was what Christ had done in giving back the glory in his life of that precious relationship with the Savior. A contemporary of this man tells exactly an opposite story in his life. Now I refer to a man whose name you do recognize, Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche. And Nietzsche was a young teenager raised in a pastor's home also, going to Bible studies, studying the scripture. Nietzsche also went through an experience as a medic in the war, where he became disillusioned. And ultimately, when he went to university, began to ask questions of meaning in life and became one of the most potent writers in anti-theistic history. As he pungently wrote and as he angrily wrote his tirade against the concept of God and wanted this world to be delivered from the shackles of a God-infested past. And yet, as he spent the last 13 years of his life in an insane asylum, 8 of those 13 years his mother sat by his bedside. Many times for 2 to 3 months he would sit silently saying absolutely nothing. He was a genius gone mad. In the book that I have just completed, I penned this paragraph of how Nietzsche's philosophy fueled his own life and what an inglorious end he had. These are the words I penned in that book, taking anti-theism to its logical outworking embodied in the life of Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche. You see, he was called Friedrich Wilhelm because he was born on the day of King Friedrich Wilhelm. And his father thought it was an ominous day as the bells were ringing, and they had great hopes for their son. But this is the way it ended. Listen to these words. I said this: "It is quite heartrending to read a description of his morbid mind and lifestyle as he ambled to his desk each day to pen his celebratory tirade against God. His life bore all the marks of physical and mental deterioration. Stooped, 5'8" and almost blind, he would return to his routine in his small, freezing and unkempt room. On a table, innumerable scraps of paper recording his erratic thoughts were stacked. In a corner, his only possessions, a threadbare suit and 2 shirts, lay in an old wooden trunk. Other than that, only books and manuscripts, no color or decoration, and a tray holding numerous jars and bottles containing drugs and potions to alleviate the debilitating pain of migraines and stomach ailments that often sent him into fits of vomiting. The sedatives and painkillers rendered him almost senseless for hours. But it was only this frightful arsenal of poisons and drugs that brought him any relief in his fast disintegrating world. He would write for hours, wrapped in his overcoat and scarf, hunched beside a stove that belched forth fumes and no heat, his eyes wearing double glasses, getting ever closer to the pages before him. Endlessly he poured his thoughts onto paper, his body shivering and his eyes burning, while his life, driven by turbulent thought, sputtered towards an inglorious end." What's the difference between a life that has the glory and a life that doesn't have it? Because what is true of individuals is also true of nations. After all, when God brought the children of Israel out of Egypt into the promised land, there were 3 great ideas that he gave to them. The first was the idea of redemption. I have brought you out of bondage and set your feet on this land flowing with milk and honey. The symbolism was clear. They were now a redeemed people. But not only were they redeemed, they were now going to be a righteous people as he gave them the moral law. And finally, he gave them the description of what classified as right and spiritual worship. That is always the sequence God expects of an individual. Redemption, righteousness, and worship. You can never change that sequence. If you are not redeemed, you cannot be righteous. And if you are not redeemed and righteous, you cannot worship. For who shall ascend unto the hill of the Lord, but he that hath clean hands and a pure heart? Redemption is indispensable to righteousness. Nothing is good apart from first being redeemed. So he brought them through that. And as he gave them the moral law and taught them what worship was all about, all of a sudden they began to yearn to be like other nations. He wanted to meet with them. Remember when he came to the mountain, he wanted to speak to them. And the people said, we don't want this. Moses, you go and represent us. Then later on, he wanted to lead them. He wanted to guide them. But they wanted to be like the other nations around them and said, we also want kings to be serving us and leaders to be serving us as other leaders are leading these surrounding nations. So what happened was they sought for a king and they wanted to be like all the other nations. And God said he was going to depart from them and that glory was going to leave them about 1,000 years into their history after the Exodus. Now here's a question I want to raise with you. When the Bible says the glory is departing, there are at least two questions we need to answer. What does the word glory really mean? Have you ever thought of that? What does the word glory really mean? C.S. Lewis in his book, The Weight of Glory, gives us a marvelous description of how he perceives this. Lewis says this, my greatest glory is when God would put his applause upon my life. And see how he says it. Nothing can eliminate from that divine parable, well done thou good and faithful servant. With that, a good deal of what I had been thinking all my life fell down like a house of cards. I suddenly remembered that no one can enter heaven except as a child, as its great and undisguised pleasure in being praised. I am not forgetting how horribly this most innocent desire is parodied in our human ambitions, or how very quickly, in my own experience, the lawful pleasure of praise from those whom it was my duty to please turns into the deadly poison of self-admiration. But I thought I could detect a moment, a very, very short moment before this happened, during which the satisfaction of having pleased those whom I rightly loved and rightly feared was pure. And that is enough to raise our thoughts to what may happen when the redeemed soul, beyond all hope and nearly beyond all belief, learns at last that she has pleased him whom she was created to please. So he says, even though when we talk about praise, it is very brief because so quickly it turns into self-worship or self-glory. He says there is that slender moment that you notice even in a child. When you praise that child, where the child is so thrilled that the one who he respects and loves is pleased with him or her. And what Lewis is saying is, the greatest glory of my life will lie in the fact that someday I will hear my heavenly Father, before whom I will bow down, who will give me that divine accolade, well done, thou good and faithful servant. Fame with God, that is going to be my greatest glory. Ah, but here's the rub. The idea slips in because it is not stated. I have pored over these passages more than many other passages in my study, and I want you to notice something. Whenever the word glory is used, there is a concept that emerges. I want you to listen now. Here is Exodus 19. The story tells us how it is enveloped in a imposing cloud, and the people are standing in the distance. Listen to what the Bible says here. Then Moses led the people out of the camp to meet with God. And they stood at the foot of the Mount Sinai, which was covered with smoke, because the Lord descended on it in the fire. The smoke billowed up from it like smoke from a furnace. You see the radiance here now. The whole mountain trembled violently, and the sound of the trumpet grew louder. Then Moses spoke, and the voice of God answered him. Again, an idea just slips through until you come into the New Testament. And you see Jesus going up that Mount of Transfiguration, and his body begins to glow with a radiance, the doxa image, the luminosity. It is the whitest whiteness the human mind could conceive. And here stand Peter, James, and John in proximity, and they fall prostrate as these figures of Moses and Elijah descend from the heavenlies. And all of a sudden a voice is heard, rending the heavens, saying, "This is my beloved Son, listen to him." Sandwiched between Exodus 19 and the New Testament story of Jesus' transfiguration, you have several passages describing his glory. In Ezekiel 10, we hear God's glory departing, and we hear this: his voice was like the sound of a rushing army. In Ezekiel 47, the glory is returning, and we are told this, that his glory was present, and the voice was like the sound of a mighty river. And then you see in the Psalms, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork. There is no language nor speech where his voice is not heard. Here it is, where the glory of God dwells, there the voice of God is heard. So you see, the divine accolade, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant," is to understand that my greatest glory is not only in hearing the voice of God, but hearing that this God has approved of my life and approved of your life. Which tells me this: when the glory of God departs, the voice of God has gone. Are you with me? When the glory of God departs, the voice of God has left a people. And I want to analyze then, if that's what glory means, the voice of God, as Exodus tells us, as Ezekiel tells us, as the New Testament writers tell us, where the glory of God dwells, there the voice of God is heard, then I have to ask this question: why then did that voice leave? God gives us 4 reasons. I'd like to give to you some of them in detail, some of them very quickly. Number 1, the glory of God departed and his voice left the people because God tells us that the leadership in the temple, the spiritual leadership that was to lead the people, had betrayed their trust. And the first blame is laid not at the door of secular power. The first blame is laid not at the door of secular businesses. The first blame is laid not at the educational places of that time. In chapter 10, we are told the glory departed. Chapter 11, the first thing he tells us is because the leadership of the people, the spiritual leadership, had betrayed the trust. And ladies and gentlemen, what I want to point out to you is that in our time, I am not so nearly worried about what political leaders are doing to betray their trust. Maybe the greatest tragedy of the last 20 years is what spiritual leaders have done to betray their trust. That's where the problem began. And this happened very clearly even in Israel. You see, when the time came where they wanted to become king, I want you to follow this. This is a carefully woven argument. When the time came where they wanted to be like all the other nations, and their glory was going to be in the approval of other nations, and they wanted to be delivered from political responsibility, give us a king, they said. And the first king was King Saul. But do you notice there all of a sudden seemed to be 2 lines of government in Israel? Saul is the monarch. He is the king. But every time Saul goes wrong in his life, there is a knock on the door. Whose knock is that? It's Samuel. Saul, why did you do this? God told you not to bring back any booty after this war. And Saul tried to give some excuse and justify it. Here are the 2 lines. What separated Israel from all the other surrounding nations? Follow me now. In the surrounding nations, the king told the prophets what to do. In Israel, as God had ordained that setting, the prophets told the king what to do. And so when Samuel knocked on the door, he said, I have to talk with you, Saul. You have betrayed the trust. Saul comes and goes off the scene. Next we see David, who was given this enormous privilege until that terrible sin came into his life with Bathsheba. And David thinks he's going to smother that and run away from it and even kill her husband so that nobody would ever find out. But there's a knock on David's door. Who's at the door? It's Nathan the prophet. Again, the voice of God that came to Saul through Samuel now is coming to David through Nathan. Something dramatic happens after David. I don't know if you've ever noticed it. Saul had Samuel. David had Nathan. Can you give me one instance after Solomon became king of a prophet that he consulted? There isn't. You can search and search and search. Solomon used his wisdom for self-glory. All of a sudden, there was no voice from God. The temple became grand. Solomon's home became even grander. He plunged the nation into bankruptcy. There is no voice in the life of Solomon. There is a vacuum all of a sudden. You know, that's a terrible thing when a man is plunging a nation into economic debt, when a man is plunging a nation into such criminal, adulterated religion, when false gods were being erected, when the concubines were in the palatial precincts, when a man became known all around for his greatness and his grandeur, so that the Queen of Sheba came and said, not even the half is told of how great this man is. Where is the voice of the prophet in Solomon's life? Any king, anywhere, at any time, is living dangerously with destiny if there is no prophetic voice in his or her life. You think that's the end? No. Something even more intricate happens after Solomon goes off the scene. Jeroboam comes. Notice how the Bible says it so clearly in 1 Kings 13 about Jeroboam. Even after this, Jeroboam did not change his evil ways, but once more appointed priests for the high places from all sorts of people. Anyone who wanted to become a priest, he consecrated for the high offices. This was the sin of the house of Jeroboam that led to its downfall and to its destruction from the face of the earth. So we move from the prophetic voices talking to the king to the complete absence of a voice, till the manipulations of the kings of appointing people who would make them feel comfortable. Unqualified prophets and priests were elected to office by Jeroboam. Now lies are being given to the leadership. The glory has departed. When the glory of God departs, the voice of God has left a people. And I want to analyze then, if that's what glory means, the voice of God, as Exodus tells us, as Ezekiel tells us, as the New Testament writers tell us, where the glory of God dwells, there the voice of God is heard. Then I have to ask this question: why then did that voice leave? God gives us 4 reasons. I'd like to give to you some of them in detail, some of them very quickly. Number 1, the glory of God departed and his voice left the people because God tells us that the leadership in the temple, the spiritual leadership that was to lead the people, had betrayed their trust. And the first blame is laid not at the door of secular power. The first blame is laid not at the door of secular businesses. The first blame is laid not at the educational places of that time. In chapter 10, we are told the glory departed. Chapter 11, the first thing he tells us is because the leadership of the people, the spiritual leadership, had betrayed the trust. And ladies and gentlemen, what I want to point out to you is that in our time, I am not so nearly worried about what political leaders are doing to betray their trust. Maybe the greatest tragedy of the last 20 years is what spiritual leaders have done to betray their trust. That's where the problem began. I have reflected upon the North American continent over the last 20 years. What went wrong? Why was it while we were building glorious church edifices? Why was it while budgets were beginning to boom, tens and tens of millions coming into so-called evangelical coffers, voices over the air 24 hours round the clock, people asking for more money and more money and more money, and the glitter and the grandeur became bigger and bigger, till a book was being written, Can Evangelicalism Survive Its Own Popularity? Till in the 1980s, Time magazine had a cover called The Year of the Evangelical. Millions of dollars were going into building programs, millions of dollars in order to build personal empires. And the question that I come to now, after we see some of these edifices fallen, I ask the question, like Solomon, did we begin to have grander outward expressions with no voice from God closer to where it really mattered? And I present to you, this may be the darkness with which we are living. Yes, I know you're troubled and I'm troubled. I begin to think of the decisions that are coming from government quarters, and it breaks my heart. Many times in the morning when I go to work, I don't even listen to the news anymore. But let me tell you something that maybe bypasses us. In the last 20 years, if you go into the seminary scene, maybe it is changing now, and I think it is changing now. But when I was a professor for 4 years on evangelism and contemporary thought, and I say this without having to apologize for anybody, I remember talking to young students who wanted to go into the ministry. Their questions had more to do with money and power and position and privileges. And they were quite crass. Questions were quite open. How much does a person earn? How does one do this? How does one do that? When I think of years ago from places like the Salvation Army, when men and women were sent out to the uttermost parts of the earth, on the day of graduation, they would be told where they were going when they didn't even know where it would be until it was told to them in public. Somewhere in the last 20 years, we lost it. And there's a different kind of spiritual leader that emerged in the 70s and 80s. I think it's true, and I'm sorry if I'm overstating it, but I think it became true. And maybe I can compare it to put it more in perspective this way. In 1974, I was preaching in Cambodia. And on the last night, 2 men took me out for dinner. I was still in my mid-20s. And one was a young fellow, a major. His name was Chirk, Chirrrc. And next to him was the Bible Society director, Sun Son. They took me to the Le Phnom Hotel where all the foreign press was living at that time. The hotel itself had been devastated. Food poisoning was rife all over. But they wanted to do something for me. After 5 weeks of preaching where hundreds had come to Christ in Cambodia. You need to know that in Cambodia between 1923 and 1968, there were only 80 baptized believers. And all of a sudden, the floodgates of heaven opened, and literally thousands were being swept into the kingdom. In one campaign I preached at in the city of Battambang, over 600 came to Christ in one night. This was after 4 decades of only 80 people belonging to any church anywhere. So these 2 men were instruments in the hands of God. Went into the airport next day, and I wrapped my arms around Chirk and Sanson. Bid them goodbye because I never knew if I was going to see them again. Shortly thereafter, the Khmer Rouge had taken over and led their onslaught of bloodletting and hatred as ultimately 1 million were going to be slaughtered. I got on my telephone immediately and phoned the head office of the Christian and Missionary Alliance. I said, any word about what happened to Chirk when they came in? He said, yes, Ravi. We sent an American helicopter onto the American consulate and sent a messenger to Chirk and to Son and tell them we would get them out of the country because they were wanted men by the Khmer Rouge. Chirk looked at his wife and children, brought them over to the American consulate to put them into the plane. I do not recall if his wife left or not. All I do know for sure is this. As he embraced the rest of his family members, he said, if I'm able to lead even one Khmer Rouge to Christ, I'm willing to do that by paying with my life. And within a matter of hours, the Khmer Rouge had taken Chirk in front of the French consulate and gunned him down. They took Sanson into the waters and drowned him. Think of the quality of leadership there. That's why revival broke out in Cambodia. When the voice of God has gone, let us first look at spiritual leadership. That indeed is to be central. So the first and the major thought was that spiritual leadership is central. Secondly, self-glory or self-aggrandizement is fatal. Self-glory or self-aggrandizement is fatal. C.S. Lewis said this, there is one vice in the world from which no man is free, which everyone loathes when he sees it in someone else, and of which hardly any people except Christians ever imagine that they are guilty themselves. I have heard people admit that they are bad-tempered or that they cannot keep their heads above girls or drink, or even that they are cowards. I do not think I have ever heard anyone who was not a Christian accuse himself of this vice of pride. It is the essential vice, the utmost evil. Unchastity, anger, greed, drunkenness, and all that are mere flea bites in comparison. It was through pride that the devil became the devil. For pride leads to every other vice. It is the complete anti-God state of mind. Ezekiel 27 tells us how the nation of Tyre thought it was glorious, greatest artisans, greatest structures, so that people would stand by their shores and watch the ships that Tyre built and say, what glorious ships, what is the glory of Tyre? Then an east wind caught it, and suddenly as it was strapped, its best seamen could not help it. And as that boat was going down, people were standing by the shores, now talking about the glory of Tyre that once stood. India used to be called Sone ki Chidiya, which means the golden bird. So much of that glory has gone. We're a young nation here. It is possible for the glory to be tarnished and gone from here too if we aggrandize ourselves and think we have no need for the voice of God anymore. Self-aggrandizement is fatal. We stayed in a kibbutz on the Sea of Galilee, or the Sea of Galilee there, called Kibbutz Ein Gev, where we'll be staying again shortly. The last time we were in the area, they were describing everything. They've got all these modern amenities, got marvelous concert halls. It is incredible, everything they've got, right not far from the Golan Heights. And one of my friends who was visiting there said, how come you don't have any synagogue here to worship? He said, we have no buildings for which the people express no need. So, no need to worship, therefore we've got our tractors. Why build our synagogues? And all of a sudden, the nation began to demonstrate that this was their own tragedy. And think of how it's happened in our time. Think of the gender conflict. I've seen colleges now advertising themselves as giving you a sense of empowerment, as if that's all we are lacking. I see the sociological fabric of sexuality becoming desacralized to an incredibly dreadful point. Till I was in Toronto, Canada a few weeks ago, and a young pedophile, convicted pedophile, who had abused young boys, was on a radio broadcast defending the sexuality between men and young boys. And the interviewer was outraged, but he had her on a spin because given her desacralization of sex, she didn't know how to even counter him. He had established an 800 number across Canada for boys upwards of 4 or 6 to call men if they wanted to be with a man for the purposes he had described. Boys upwards of 4 to 6. And Bell Canada had decided to take that telephone number away from him, and he was now suing Bell Canada. Well, you desacralize that which God has rendered sacred. Which way are you going to go when the voice of God is not there anymore? Self-aggrandizement is fatal. Have you noticed that only in the Christian faith, listen to me please, only in the Christian faith there is a cross. In Hinduism, you pull yourself out by your own moral bootstraps. In Buddhism, you meditate yourself into it. In Islam, you solve it by the sword. When I was finishing one of the chapters in the book, Can Man Live Without God on the Cross, which touched my life more than anything else, I walked into Margie's area where she was entering all of this into the computer. And I saw her sitting at the chair reading that chapter on the cross and tears running down her face. And she made this comment. She said, Ravi, it just struck me. Because one of your earlier chapters talked about the earthly utopias. Now you're talking about the hope of heaven. She said, I have come to the conclusion after reading this that the difference between earthly utopias and heaven is the cross. That's why the former can never be. You follow that? The difference between an earthly utopia and heaven is the cross. That's why the former can never be. That's why I think it was Bernard of Clairvaux who said, what language shall I borrow to thank you, dearest friend, for this thy dying sorrow, thy pity without end. O make me thine forever, and should I fainting be, Lord, let me never, never outlive my love for thee. I sometimes think about the cross and shut my eyes and try to see the cruel nails, the crown of thorns, and Jesus crucified for me. But even could I see him die, I would but see a little part of that great love which like a fire was always burning in his heart. Have you been to the cross yourself? To strip yourself of that self-aggrandizement. Have you noticed what Paul says? And I think I detect why he says it, and I may be wrong. Listen, that I may know him, the power of his resurrection, and the fellowship of his suffering, being made conformable unto his death. Why did he want to be made conformable unto the death of Christ? All the other disciples, listen, all the other disciples came to Christ knowing him through his birth, his life, his death, his resurrection, a logical sequence. The Apostle Paul is the only one of his early followers and his disciples who came the reverse way on the basis of the resurrection, as it were. He went back to the cross, and he did not understand the cross because he had lived with personal glory of the moral law. He was going to keep the law and attain heavenhood that way. He says, no, I need to become conformable unto his death. The resurrection, yes, great glory, but what I need to do in my life is to become more conformable to the image of Christ as was portrayed in the cross. Until our leaders, political and religious, and I say political here specifically now, until our leadership, be it at Capitol Hill or the White House or anywhere in this land in state or local levels, until they learn how to bow low before him and understand the cross, they will never understand the greatness of what it is to have God's glory dwelling among the midst of the people. The cross signifies the humility needed. So here we have it. Spiritual leadership is central. Self-aggrandizement is fatal. Thirdly and quickly, obedience to known truth is crucial. Meaning, God said, I called you, you didn't hear me. Now you're calling to me, I'm not going to answer you. I don't have time to build this, but I just want to say this. Have you thought of how deadly silence can be? Let me share with you today something that I think is going to touch your heart. 2 weeks ago tonight, about 1:15 a.m. to be precise, early Sunday morning, my phone rang. And I picked it up. And as my sister-in-law, Margie's sister Barbie from Longview, Texas, crying on the phone, she says, Ravi? I said, yeah. She said, something's happened to Gordon. Gordon's her husband. He's the head flight instructor at LaTourneau, an excellent pilot, been there for many years. He had taken 2 young men on a routine flight instruction. They were learning to fly in the mountains. They were coming back, I think, somewhere from Nevada. And around the middle of the day, or at noon or 2 or something, they lost contact with them. And she said at 3:30 he was supposed to land somewhere and never reported there. They've tried to make radio contact, and they have not heard from him. And I have just gotten off the phone from somebody telling me from the control tower there that a search team had been sent in the Colorado mountains and had received a signal of a downed aircraft in a canyon that was about 5,000 feet deep. It's a long story. We can't go into the details, except to tell you the upshot of the whole thing. Somewhere around 2 a.m. Colorado time, a search crew had begun to go down that canyon, and it took them 4 hours to get there. And they found the shattered plane out there. And these 3 men had been knocked unconscious. And the stories began to emerge. And Gordon had a fractured pelvis, a pulverized femur, 2 broken ankles, a broken foot, 2 broken hands, a forehead that had been smashed with bone fragments that were only a 1/16 of an inch away from the brain. Gordon is going through a very, very difficult time reliving these moments. And all he can say now is that he didn't land that plane. All he knew was he hit a tree that knocked him unconscious, and that plane came crashing into that area there. And as they sat there for hours before their rescue, tell me for a moment, when that phone rang with barely half a ring and she picked up that phone, whose voice was she waiting for? Not mine. She picked that up. It was probably desperately hoping against hope. That'll be Gordon. And when Gordon was finally rescued in this broken hand and broken hip and broken femur and everything shattered, as it were, bloodied face, he says, as I was regaining consciousness, the only thing in my mind was, I wish I could get a hold of Barbie and tell her I'm all right. God wants to speak to you. He wants to speak to me. He wants to speak to us as a nation. He's calling. His voice. How dreadful it is when silence plagues our nations and there is no prophetic voice anymore, it seems, on the horizon. I say it, spiritual leadership is central. Self-aggrandizement is fatal. Obedience to known truth is crucial. But lastly, it is this, responsibility is personal. People started to say, our fathers ate sour grapes, our teeth are set on edge. God says no. Says the visions are failing. God says no, it's going to come to pass. And then he says to him, finally, he says, They said, perhaps a single righteous man can save us. And God said, no, why don't you set your own house in order? I say to you, the tide moves. It moves in that certain direction. But I draw comfort. I draw comfort from the fact that God always brings it down to the individual. And he says, set your house in order first. He said to Nehemiah, take the men and put them in front of their own homes. Let them build a wall in front of their own homes first. And I am confident today, and I say this without any pretense, please hear me, I'm absolutely confident today that if the Church of Jesus Christ sets her house in order, we will see revival break out in this land. I have no doubt about that whatsoever. And how does that begin? It begins in your life, and it begins in mine. So the finger can't be pointed there. As much as it pains you and me, I have to look this way and say, Ravi, is righteousness and justice from God the foundation of your life? Is God's voice present in my life? What a wonderful thing when you can say the glory is present, the voice of God is heard. I have two simple applications to make, and then I'll be through. But I want you just to follow this argument. If there is darkness, could it be from the dust of the herd running in the wrong direction? If there is darkness, could it be from the dust of the herd running in the wrong direction? Are you and I willing to stand alone if need be and move in the right direction where the darkness dissipates and the light shines brightly? I look at my 3 kids, and my greatest desire for them is that the glory of God will dwell in their lives. I desire that for you. I desire that for myself, which means we take that personal step. Listen to the words of Muggeridge. The world's way to responding to intimations of decay is to engage equally in idiot hopes and idiot despair. On the one hand, some new policy or discovery is confidently expected to put everything to rights. A new fuel, a new drug, détente, world government. On the other hand, some disaster is as confidently expected to prove our undoing. Capitalism will break down. Fuel will run out. Plutonium will lay us low. Atomic waste will kill us off. Overpopulation will suffocate us, or alternatively, a declining birth rate will put us more at the mercy of our enemies. In Christian terms, such hopes and fears are equally beside the point. For as Christians, we know that here we have no continuing city, that crowns roll in the dust, and every earthly kingdom must sometimes flounder. Whereas we acknowledge a king men did not crown and cannot dethrone, as we are citizens of a city of God they did not build and cannot destroy. Thus the apostle wrote to the Christians in Rome, living in a society as depraved and as dissolute as ours. Their games, like our television, specialized in spectacles of violence and eroticism. Paul exhorted them to be steadfast, unmovable, always abounding in God's work, to concern themselves with the things that are unseen, for the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal. It was in the breakdown of Rome that Christendom was born. Now in the breakdown of Christendom, there are the same requirements and the same possibilities to eschew the fantasy of a disintegrating world and to seek the reality of what is not seen and eternal, the reality of Christ. Spiritual leadership is central. Self-aggrandizement is fatal. Obedience to known truth is crucial. Responsibility is personal. When those truths were espoused, the glory returned, and his voice was like the sound of rushing waters.